We have 4 papers. The first one is Lynn Schofield-Clark, Anchoring Narratives, Theorizing How Young People Are Encouraged to Navigate Traumas of Resettlement and Poverty in Digital Spaces. Then Isra Ali, Secular Muslims, Social Media and the Reformation of Islam in the Early 21st Century. That will be followed by Margaret Hamm and Kate Hoeting of Harvard Divinity School, #Christian Check, Defining Faith in a Post-Secular Age Through TikTok. And finally, Kristin Peterson of Boston College, Love Jesus Simple, the Secular Marketing Strategies of Emerging Urban Churches. I don't know about you all, but I'm incredibly excited to hear all of these papers. What we're going to do is let all of the scholars present, and then we will have a question session at the end. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat and we will moderate them at the end, because I think there's going to be a good crossover discussion amongst all these papers, and the scholars will pass the baton off to each other as we go along. So I'm going to sit back and hand it over to Lynn Schofield-Clark.
Thanks, Mara, and thanks to all of you who are joining us, whether it's afternoon or morning where you are, or some other time of the middle of the night. We appreciate you being with us. So let's get started, and I get to kick things off in this panel. So I have to start out by saying that when I saw the conference theme, I wasn't actually sure what secularities was to mean in the context of media and religion. So actually, I decided to retitle my talk to try to start off by addressing that. So let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully that worked. So the title of my talk is Introducing the Concept of Anchoring Narratives, or Questioning Secularities and Proposing Trauma-Informed Studies of Media, Religion, and Culture. And I'll pick up on some of what Marwan said in the last session about secularization being tied to a Western Christian approach. I'm of course familiar with secularism and secularization and the debate over whether we, on one hand, are in a post-secular moment with emergent forms of meaning and spirituality, or on the other hand, if we're in a time when secularism is on the rise, meaning that the influence of organized religion, and specifically the influence of Christianity, is on the decline. Debates about secularization certainly seem resonant in Northern European contexts, as I find that many in those contexts consider their own cultures to be secular, as in distance from the state church. And I imagine secularization also resonates with those in North America who are following the stories about the ever-increasing number of people who, when asked about their religious affiliation, select none. But what I'm wondering, whether we members of this panel, most of us who do ethnographic work in specific contexts, both in or at some distance from organized religion, whether we're being asked to talk about lived secularities, similar to the ways that many of us in media and religion circles have in the past talked about lived religion. In other words, how people are living the practices of secularism in ways that might draw on or might reinvent and reshape religion. We've been invited here to talk about how religions like Islam are becoming more secular, or as Isra will discuss, or how identification with faith plays out in a secular space like TikTok, as Margaret and Kate will discuss, or how religious groups adopt what have been seen as secular activities, such as marketing, as Kristin will talk about. And so just as the scholarly framework of lived religions always moved the borders of our research to encompass practices and performances that took place outside the bounds of traditional religious organizations, the ideas of secularities can move us even further from those religious organizations. But I do question whether the idea of secularities itself may still center religion, and in particular organized religion and Christianity, or alternately Islam or Judaism, although on this panel we aren't talking much about Judaism, unfortunately, maybe because there actually is a pretty vibrant tradition of talking about lived secular Judaism. In any case, I wonder if this centering of religion by looking at things through the prism of the quote, secular, unquote, might be limiting what we're choosing to notice, we scholars who are at the intersections of both world religions and global and increasingly platformed media ecosystems that we live with. And I'm hoping that we can debate this some at the end of this panel. I say this because in my own ethnographic work with US young people in school and in after-school settings for the past 15 years, I've never found the term secular to be particularly useful as a descriptor of communities, groups, movements, organizations, individuals, or practices. The term itself seems too rigid and too freighted. So I'm going to set aside the term secular for now, but I will return to it at the end of the talk. I'm interested in Other ways, oh, there we go. So lived secularities rather than lived religion. I've already lost track of where I am, and just focus on what we're choosing not to notice. This happens as you get older. You can't really read the small print. So that's on the side of my screen. I'm interested in other ways that humans share lived experience and in how those lived experiences create bonds, and then how they challenge or break other bonds. In particular, I've been interested in the lived experiences of trauma and how those lived experiences are understood as a kind of disruption that is common to displacement, dispossession, discrimination, forced mobility, and poverty. We're living in an unprecedented time of mobility that is expected only to increase due to climate change and related natural disasters, as well as wars and political struggle over resources. A report issued at the end of June 2021 by the UN Human Rights Commission stated that some 82.4 million people are displaced in the world today. That number has doubled since 2010 and is higher than it has ever been. There are some 7.6 billion people in the world. So that means that 1 out of every 100 people in the world is displaced. So if you think of your neighborhood and imagine that 1 out of every 100 of your neighbors were forced to leave their homes. And that is not accounting for the often intersecting traumas related to domestic violence and abuse, separation, disease, and death that often accompany displacement and other forms of trauma. By all accounts, all of us in the world are now dealing with some form of collective trauma in the aftermath of COVID-19 and the incalculable losses related to the global pandemic. So experiences of trauma are visceral and life-changing. They can engulf and incapacitate people. They scramble perspectives. They compound tragedy. They warp the sense of what is possible. Refugee and other AIDS organizations speak of the importance of addressing trauma at individual and community levels, and they note the need for individual and collective healing. Increasingly, schools, especially urban schools around the world where displaced young persons who are fortunate enough to be relocated end up, schools increasingly talk about taking a trauma-informed approach to learning, just as social workers talk about engaging in trauma-informed practices, and Christian pastors and Muslim community leaders engage in trauma-informed care. Jewish communities have a much longer tradition of trauma-informed care, in particular for the Holocaust survivors and their families. I wonder, what would it look like to take a trauma-informed approach to studying the intersections of world religions and media? What kinds of questions would we ask? Whose voices would be authoritative in this space? Would this be a way of inviting scholars and activists from the global south into the conversations of world religions and platformed and traditional media? How would people grappling with the violence between Israelis and Palestinians near the city of Hebron in the West Bank raise questions of media, religion, and trauma, for example? There are some ways that media entrepreneurs are entering this space of trauma that we in this circle might be well positioned to analyze given our expertise. For instance, I'm thinking in particular of mental health apps that suggest that cognitive behavioral therapy can give individuals and help individuals to address the effects of trauma. Such apps encourage us to recognize when we're thinking negative thoughts, for instance, and they remind us to change our thought patterns. Those coming from indigenous healing perspectives in North America among those who are skeptical of this kind of approach to trauma. Native American indigenous perspectives instead emphasize the importance of narrative to healing and community resilience. This centering of narrative in the human experience also resonates with the 20th century American social psychologist Jerome Bruner. Late in his life, Bruner contested the idea of the computer model of the mind, instead advocating more holistic approaches to cognitive processes. In his book, Acts of Meaning from 1990, Bruner argued that there are two forms of thinking, the paradigmatic and the narrative. The paradigmatic is the realm of science and is characterized by categorization and classification, like categories of the religion and secular, for instance. The other form of thinking, the narrative approach, organizes everyday interpretations of the world into storied form. Narrative is about constituting and framing stories in a broader perspective and in relation to specific aims shaped by those with whom we're interacting. As Bruner wrote, we constantly construct and reconstruct ourselves to meet the needs of the situations we encounter. Indigenous scholars, using terms like Anishinaabe scholar Gerald Visner's concept of survivance, have argued that personal survival and collective resistance are connected through the ability to tell the stories shared within a community. Narrativizing trauma is viewed as an important step in healing and personal narratives, sometimes created via video, audio, or photo voice, and they can thus create the kind of social bonds that strengthen communities and build resolve, as Black and Indigenous feminist scholars such as Ramona Beltran and others have argued. In our darkest days, then, a narrative, such scholars and healers and practitioners have argued, offer a way to organize and make sense of the world and can remind us of our best selves, who we are, who loves us, who we aspire to be. This is an approach that has made narrative an attractive form of healing and pedagogy, and narrativizing has come to be viewed as a method for the reclaiming of individual and community agency. Because we don't have time, I'm glad to share a link or in later time, share some of my work that my colleagues and I have done that is involved inviting young people from refugee, immigrant, and asylum-seeking backgrounds to share mediated narratives of trauma and collective resilience using digital stories that are then shared via YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram stories. These narratives have been mobilized for personal healing and also for sharing both collective trauma and experiences of structural racism and discrimination. And those have been shared with legislators in order to inform policy change. I've used the term anchoring narratives as a way of describing how narratives like these have been created in situations of healers and caregivers for the purpose of individual and collective healing. I do want to note, though, that there's a pretty lively debate about narrativizing trauma. As some of that I've mentioned view trauma as the starting point for change, but we also need to be conscientious when encouraging the narratizing of trauma, particularly in a social media age, when such narratives can open individuals up to the possibility of being shamed and being further misunderstood or dismissed. Given our current mediated environment, those creating narratives risk further traumatization, as media scholar Mirka Madianu suggests in her work. Furthermore, encouraging the sharing of such narratives via social media also contributes to surveillance. And we already know that our most vulnerable populations are more likely than others to be surveilled and least likely to have control over how data about them will be used. And finally, there's the question of the need for poignant stories to find the right audience, or in fact, any audience, because when no one listens or when such narratives are greeted with indifference, as is too often the case in the contemporary US, that can be incredibly disempowering. But it could be that the sharing of narrative can outstrip the individualized notions of resilience that get packed into these ideas of trauma, that the way they're understood and the way they're addressed in the US, so that we might think about how we can move toward a social recognition of collective vulnerability that is not something to be overcome, but is to be embraced. Recognizing our collective vulnerability might be the only way, in fact, that we can begin to ask the question, in the face of heightened trauma, how resilient our societies and our institutions of governance, as well as of care. Are they resilient, and can they be? So I'll close here because I'm running out of time, but I do want to just highlight that there are a number of scholars who are working in areas like what Amanda Lagerfis has called existential media studies, centering the exister in search of meaning as opposed to the savvy user of technologies, and what Kevin Healing has called contemplative media studies, which looks at social media platforms and considers how alternatives might better support human development, and Amit Kinchevsky, who's also working quite a bit on trauma and the role of media in re-traumatization. These are some of the foundations I think that we can explore to look at what it might mean to take a trauma-informed approach to the study of media, religion, and secularities. And I look forward to our conversations that will follow the rest of my panelists' presentations. So now I'm glad to turn things over to Isra. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for having me. My name is Isra Ali, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see that. And I am at NYU University and very happy, or NYU rather, but very happy to be here. Thoroughly have enjoyed the conversations that we've been having so far and very much looking forward to hearing questions and comments afterwards and to discussing with my fellow presenters. I'm going to read just to make sure that I keep within time. So my apologies if I'm not always looking directly at you. Today, I'm going to talk about conversations taking place in the realm of social media on the question of the reformation of Islam. These conversations are taking place in the context of the global war on terror and the ongoing militarism it has produced. I use these conversations to consider how the digital or the internet are presumed to be a secular space, a presumption that is evident in many discussions of social media users who explicitly identify as religious and who are in turn characterized as a subset of users apart from the general population of users. The way that I approach analysis of this perception of the digital as a secular and the implied equivalence being made between neutrality and secularism is through a study of discussions about Islam by Muslims and non-Muslims online. Discussions about Islam are a particularly productive site from which to think about how digital media has come to be seen as a secular space that is seized upon by religious organizations and individuals, and where pious and secular users are assumed to be distinct and separate from one another. Discussions on the reformation of Islam on social media center on the quote problem that Islam poses to secular society, both on and offline. These conversations are essentially discourses on the anxieties that have arisen around the concept of the nation state over the last few decades, particularly in the era of war on terror militarism, where borders and citizenship have become central areas of concern. Amongst Muslims on social media, discussions around the likelihood of a reformation of Islam illustrate how Muslims respond in various ways to the perception that Muslim culture presents a challenge to the nation state and national identity, as Islamic belief and practice are continually blamed for issues that arise between the state and Muslim immigrant populations in non-Muslim majority nations, and also the which Muslim nation states are considered bad actors who actively thwart the project of modernity, which is most often discussed in terms of the existence of homophobia, misogyny, and racism in these countries. The era of global war on terror militarism in the early 21st century has placed significant emphasis on the concept of Muslim culture. Laila Abulugod, Sabah Mahmood, Deepa Kumar, and others have illustrated how gender equality and the oppression of Muslim women, for example, is utilized to make the argument that Muslim culture is beyond reform and can only be achieved in Muslim majority societies through applied force. Jaspir Puar makes an argument in her conceptualization of homo nationalism, where she illustrates how the persecution of queer people is foregrounded in the discourse on Muslims and the incompatibility of Muslim and Western societies. Muslim culture is often blamed both for terrorism and for the military failures of allied governments in the global war on terror. It is Muslim culture's perceived resistance to modernity that is often thought to be at fault for the seemingly endless and increasingly apparently futile forever wars. We can see this today in relation to the discussion of the US withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, where Islam and its stubborn rejection of modernity are blamed for the US's failure to enact the project of nation building it claimed to be undertaking, and for the persistence of the Taliban, rather than say bad strategy and bad foreign policy and interference by other nation states. This is a viewpoint I've seen espoused primarily by non-Muslims, but is also articulated by some Muslims. Discourses on the reformation of Islam are deeply imbricated with discourses on war on terror militarism, sometimes explicitly so, sometimes more implicitly, and it is impossible to consider an analysis of the rise of the discussions of the reformation of Islam in the early 21st century, or the bringing on of the period of, quote, enlightenment in the Muslim world without an analysis of the role Muslim culture has played in the strategies and logics of war on terror militarism. Here, I'm focusing on those who identify as Muslim on social media and who are engaging in discourses on the reformation of Islam through an embrace of socially progressive politics and democracy. Those Muslim users fall into two broad categories, and the first, who you see illustrated here, consists of those who identify as former Muslims who see Islam and, quote, Muslim culture as inherently harmful. These are people like Ayan Hirsi Ali and Shadi Hamid and Ali A. Rizvi and his organization, the Secular Jihadists, who have all built a significant presence on social media and also in the realm of print publishing and television commentary through a critique of Islam. For these, quote, former Muslims, Islam is homophobic, misogynistic, and irredeemably abusive and fundamentalist. And the reformation of Islam is necessary because Islam poses an explicit threat to secular culture and modernity. But their arguments often center on the impossibility of such a reformation, thereby reiterating the incompatibility of Islam, secularism, and modernity. The process of modernization and secularism, therefore, entails denouncing Islam and its sacred texts. Muslims who are unwilling to do so are, by definition, anti-modernity and a threat to secularism. These authors and pundits are often explicitly making this critique as part of their paid work, and their presence gestures to a network of think tanks, academics, and conservative funders who promote this viewpoint, as well as the existence of a significant audience for this message, all of whom together illustrate the robust marketplace for critiques of Muslim culture. Their viewpoints are especially appealing to right-wing and conservative entities because they are native informants whose arguments support the notion that nation states with Muslim minority populations ought to actively police and regulate those communities and should also police Muslim nation states by force if necessary. These secular Muslims provide support for veiling bans and limits on the immigration of Arab and African Muslims to Western Europe and North America. And their arguments also situate Muslims living in those nation states as outside of a true conceptualization of citizenship in the nation state, but also in modernity itself, setting devout Muslims outside of the present entirely. The second category of Muslims consists of practicing Muslims who acknowledge the existence of misogyny, homophobia, and anti-Black racism in Muslim societies, but who view those beliefs and practices as antithetical to the project of Islam, a misinterpretation, so to speak. This is a pious believer who practices Islam in everyday life and belongs to Muslim communities and believes that the argument for a socially progressive practice of Islam exists within the religious scriptures of Islam and the teachings of the religion. Rather than a disavowal of Islam, there is a push to reform through an embrace of Islam. Muslim college students in the US, for example, use meme pages they create to portray the lived experience of being Muslim in the everyday, as well as to make the argument that Islam is compatible with social progress. When the moderator for the halal memes for Jannah-minded teens, which means like kosher memes for heaven-minded teens, page posts a list of rules that include a disavowal of homophobia, racism, and misogyny, the comments are generally supportive. But there are comments from Muslim users who see the acceptance of homosexuality as being at odds with Islamic practice and belief. Quote, "Since when Muslims are not homophobic? Is that what Western culture did to you? Politically correct speech is not Islamically correct speech," one respondent writes, who has since been blocked from the group. In response to this challenge, another admin posts, quote, "The normative Islamic position that same-sex sexual relations are prohibited does not correlate to dislike, disrespect, or prejudice towards homosexual people. One should respect a person even if he or she engages in sins," end quote. This response is not merely a condemnation of homophobia amongst Muslims or an argument against, quote, Western influence. It's a response that provides other Muslim users with a pathway to the acceptance of queer Muslims and homosexuality in general that is rooted in Islamic belief and that does not require saying that Islam is wrong on the issue of homosexuality itself. When memes are used repeatedly depicting Black folks as the punchline of a joke, there is an explicit discussion of how these forms of anti-Blackness impact a sense of belonging to a global Muslim community. There is even an explicit discussion of sectarianism and the divides that it creates amongst Muslims, which is often related to issues around class and citizenship. In these discussions, the reform of Islam is framed as socially progressive in ways that would make Islamic practice and belief less of a target in the diaspora. But that would also strengthen ties amongst Muslims across national identities, affirming another order of citizenship in the Muslim community or the Ummah. Implicit in the arguments they are making is the claim that Islam, and in and of itself, does not require homophobia, misogyny, racism, and classism, but rather that it is the politicization of Islam through the advent of the nation state that produces and entrenches these viewpoints and mischaracterizes them as religious. These discussions are also taking place in regards to patriarchy and feminism, where there's actually a very robust discussion about how Islam is inherently feminist and inherently it holds the idea of gender equality. And all of this is echoed by a growing number of Muslim figures in North American and European media, like Mehdi Hassan and Khalid Beydoun and others, who present themselves as true reformers, the kind of antithesis to people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Shadi Hamid. Those Muslims who are pushing for reform based in the scripture, teachings, and practice of Islam, both young Muslims who use memes to depict the lived everyday experience of Islam, and writers and teachers who are publishing books and using social media as a platform to share their message, force us to reconsider the binarization of piety and secularity. These Muslims are living within modernity in a way that can be acknowledged by non-Muslims by embracing feminism and queer identity and anti-racism, and by preaching against the isolation of Muslims from secular life. Nadia Fadil and Mayanthi Fernando argue that there is a tendency to approach the study of Islam through a division of the, quote, everyday Muslim from the Salafi Muslim, the devout Muslim, who is considered ideologically bound to a kind of politicized notion of Islam. But the conversation about the reformation of Islam happening amongst pious Muslims requires us to put aside this binarization, opening us up to a myriad questions about the use of media and digital and social media by users who view their piety as inherently compatible with secular values. Thank you. And I'm going to hand it off to our next speaker.
Hi, everyone. I am Kate Hoeting, and this is my colleague, Margaret Hamm. And I hope you all came ready to watch some TikToks because we are here to talk about Christianity in everyone's favorite new social media app.
So before we get into a brief analysis of our findings, I'm going to give you all a quick explainer of what exactly TikTok is in case you are not super familiar with the platform. So TikTok is a social media app that features video clips that range from anywhere from 15 seconds to 3 minutes long. It became available worldwide in 2018, and the TikTok app was the App Store's most downloaded app in both 2018 and 2019. TikTok relies heavily on sounds, which can include popular songs or user-generated content. And these sounds are used and reused in different trends, which allows each user to contribute their own take to a particular trend. Based on this description, you might be wondering, why does TikTok actually matter to our understanding of religion, media, and secularities? Well, because of the mimetic, interactive, and innovative nature of the app, it becomes a particularly powerful tool for transforming and spreading lived religious practice. However, there is understandably currently a gap that exists in the literature out there on TikTok and religion. Compared to apps like Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook, TikTok is still a relatively new app. And as a result, during our research process, we were unable to find any scholarly published sources that focused particularly on religion and TikTok. In addition, the religious attitudes of Gen Z, particularly as it intersects with their media habits, are still understudied, as scholars in the late 2000s and 2010s noted in a similar phenomenon for millennials.
So for the purposes of this project, we have zeroed in on just one of many Christian TikTok trends, and this is the trend #ChristianCheck, through which typically young TikTokers show material possessions that they think basically shows the depth of their faith. And so we asked the question through the lens of #ChristianCheck, what is Christianity in the eyes of TikTok's young users? And we find that TikTok is a very useful tool for Christians to create and perform their religious identity. These Christian TikTokers are, emphasizing really the materiality of their faith, and they're doing so at a time when American media often expresses extreme anxiety over the perceived dilution of Christianity in a new generation of increasingly non-religious teens to whom at first glance it seems like the tangible components of religion do not seem to matter much. But on TikTok, in the face of notions that Christianity is dead or uncool, these young TikTokers are posing their own definitions of Christianity through gendered and class values.
The typical format of a Christian check TikTok video with the audio playing under it being a worship song. And the user mounts along to a soundbite calling for a Christian check and then presents the viewer with a collection of objects that are meant to demonstrate the participant's Christianity. These objects often include personalized Bibles, devotional notes, scriptural tattoos, and cruciform jewelry, just to name a few. The trend began in June 2019 and had largely concluded by the end of the year, but it kicked off in June of 2019 with the following video.
Christian check Jesus, 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 I love to praise your name. Hey, yo.
And just a quick note of apology that we hope you all don't get sick of that song. We certainly have, but you're going to hear it a few more times in the presentation. Overall, the approximately 19.8 thousand TikToks marked with the hashtag Christian check tag have a combined 119.4 million views overall. So to get a fuller picture of the hashtag Christian check trend, and to get a fuller picture of the range of experiences it featured, we watched approximately 2,000 of the most popular videos associated with this hashtag.
We saw a pretty thorough variety of the kinds of materials that people chose to display, but one of the most common was that people love to share their Bibles. And scripture proves an excellent example of the way that material possessions are harnessed through the hashtag Christian check trend to develop ideas of not only what it means to be Christian, period, but specifically what it means to be a good Christian.
Hey, yo, Christian check. Jesus, 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 I love to praise your name. Hey.
So we can see in that TikTok, which is pretty typical, that Bible is far from empty. It's absolutely filled to the brim with notes, highlighting, and really quite beautiful illustrations. Overall, we found that the hashtag Christian check trend really put more of an emphasis on the aesthetics of scripture than on the actual content. And so this TikTok and others like it answer the question, what does engaged reading of scripture look like? One comment reads, quote, honestly, if your Bible ain't highlighted, I don't believe you actually use it. So we can see through this comment that authentic engagement with scripture requires not only physical proof, but beautiful proof. This also carries class-based implications. In one Christian tech TikTok, a teenage boy asks, anybody else have 2,000 Bibles in every room of the house? Please say yes, with a crying, laughing emoji. So this trend argues that you need objects to prove your faith, and the more objects you have, the better.
Within this framework of materiality that presents itself through this TikTok trend, engagement with capitalism is also an important aspect of the constructed Christian identity for many creators who contributed to hashtag Christian check.
Yo, yo, Christian check. Jesus, 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 I love to praise your name. Hey, yo.
So this particular TikTok shows us that there are certain external markers of capitalism, in this case, Chick-fil-A consumption, that users participating in this trend recognize as being associated with a distinctly Christian experience. However, this connection between Christianity, American Christianity in particular, and capitalism is certainly not a new phenomenon, but rather furthers an existing line of discourse through the lens of TikTok. Conversations like these appear frequently in religious studies scholarship, notably in Catherine Lofton's book, Consuming Religion, in which Lofton argues that consumption within capitalism acts as a form of religion. In addition to using the trend to convey the materiality of their Christian expression, Christian TikTokers also employed hashtag Christian check to implicitly counter secularization narratives. One way that participants in the trend achieved this objective was through featuring items, images, and events indicating that Christianity is cool and shares certain features with what might be categorized in this secular versus religious binary as quote unquote secular culture.
Hey, yo, Christian check. Jesus, 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 I love to praise your name. Hey, yo.
So in this TikTok, we see not only, once again, the consumption of Chick-fil-A, but we also see footage of a youth conference that likens worship to partying, with the gathering of young Christians positioned as a fun social event. Another way that users contested secularization narratives through this trend was by furthering a narrative of Christian persecution. The trend participants' presence on TikTok, publicly and outwardly attesting to their Christianness, proves that they've triumphed against all odds, witnessing to their faith in a society that supposedly condemns them. In one Christian Check TikTok posted on July 12, 2019, the user captioned her response to the challenge, quote, "and proud of it, hashtag Christian, hashtag he is my strength," to which one of her followers commented in response, quote, "you're a real Christian, we already knew." In relying on these arguments, Christian TikTok users counter secularization narratives, but also enforce them through the lens of Christian persecution, one that rests on the assumption that Christianity is declining at the expense of a growing oppositional secularism, ultimately situating themselves in both online and offline religious landscapes to form their identities.
In 2012, Heidi Campbell, who was in the Zoom room, pointed to storied identity, through which identity is both constructed and performed as one of the key traits of networked religion, which is precisely what we are seeing in hashtag Christian Check. The trend's display of material possessions invites viewers actively to check how Christian the video's creator really is. This creates a kind of communal policing among the Christian TikTok community, through which they together circle around through these mimetic practices around a shared selection of values and around a shared idea of what Christian identity, specifically as a member of Generation Z, really means. In turn, those who watch the video are welcomed themselves into a self-reflective process, whereby they can sort of check the strength of their own Christianity against the video creators. And more importantly, they must check the strength of their Christianity against the video creators' idea of what it means to be truly Christian. Because TikTok trends tend to gain and lose relevance with, quite frankly, alarming frequency, this trend became obsolete more than a year ago. And so looking forward, we encourage scholars to examine newer related trends as we watch TikTok become really a new space of religious identity formation. Thank you all so much for listening. We're so looking forward to the Q&A section. And we will now hand it off to Kristin Peterson.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen here. We can get started. Awesome. As everyone said, thank you everyone for attending this from wherever you are in all the different time zones. So today I'm going to talk to you about marketing campaigns from 3 different Boston urban church plants, and I'll talk a little bit about what a church plant is in a bit. But within their advertisements, these churches embrace a minimalistic, straightforward design elements that have become popular in marketing material for direct-to-consumer blands, which I'll talk a little bit about what exactly is a bland. While this hip, simple, and direct approach has brought success to companies looking to position their products as cutting through the clutter of an oversaturated ad market, this article centers on the challenges for Christian churches to evangelize through minimalistic bland design. Okay. So the marketing styles for blands is built on providing a unique and individualized experience of a product outside of a corporate institution. And these 3 churches appear to tap into a similar style of a personalized, less institutional version of Christianity by promoting messages such as love Jesus simple. But at the same time, the churches are all sponsored by the Southern Baptist Convention and endorse more conservative teachings around the Bible, gender roles, and sexual ethics. So a little bit of background on urban church plants. So over the last decade, the church plant has emerged as a new style of Christian communities, mainly based in US cities, with large populations of young, educated, more affluent transplants. So cities like Boston, New York, Seattle, San Francisco. And these are kind of counter to the mega church movement, right, which is much more of a suburban movement. And you have churches that are huge campuses with thousands of people that attend. The church plant, these are smaller communities that meet often in rented spaces at hotels or schools or other houses of worship. And the key thing is that they're wanting to be in the city center. So they're whatever's affordable that they can rent out. And these are relating to larger shifts in demographics that have been mentioned in church membership in the US. So you're having an increase in unaffiliated people and a decrease in white evangelicals. And specifically the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest evangelical Christian denomination in the US, has seen a significant drop in membership of almost 2 million over the last 15 years. And this has been written a lot about in the Christian press. So the SBC funded networks have been created to provide financial and practical support for pastors, oftentimes pastors coming from Southern cities or some of the big seminaries, to plant churches within the northern cities. And they really look towards these urban centers as kind of a missionary field that they can come and they can plant their churches, and they can reach out to what is seen as kind of this post-Christian landscape. So this is a term from the Barna Group that looks at post-Christian cities, which are mostly in the Northeast and the West, and there are definitely these more unaffiliated areas. So a key point to note is that these are not urban churches in the way, they're not focused on things like poverty or inequality. They're much more focused on the sort of unaffiliated secular landscape of these cities. And the other thing is they often play on kind of the hipster culture or the startup culture that is popular in these areas. So a little bit of background on the three churches that I looked at. So one is Mosaic Boston, they're the largest. They have two churches, one in Brookline, which is a city outside of Boston, but it's very urban, very affluent and highly educated. Jamaica Plain, which is kind of a gentrifying area of Boston. City on a Hill, which has 4 churches. They're kind of a network approach in Brookline, Somerville, Brighton, and Jamaica Plain. And then Kings Hill, which meets downtown at a hotel in Back Bay. And so all of these churches meet in, if you know anything about Boston or Boston areas, these are more affluent, educated, mainly white or Asian American areas of Boston. And so what I was looking at with this was I was looking at their ads that they ran on public transit. So if you've been to Boston, you've probably seen these ads. They started around 2018. Some are still in buses now. And so they ran on public transit for the last few years. And I also looked at their websites and their social media presence as well. So the emergence of Blands. So what I'm looking at in this project is thinking about how these church plants reflect the minimalistic design that has become popular in what's termed Blands. And so Blands are products that seek to kind of cut out the middleman and provide a one-stop solution for daily problems. And so Schote, in an article in Bloomberg, talks about this idea that there's kind of a duality to Blands. So they're kind of meant to be groundbreaking and unique and original, but at the same time, they follow a very similar kind of formula for how to advertise. And so you have companies like Casper Mattresses, Warby Parker Glasses, Harry's Razors. So they're meant to be really simple and easy. And the advertising is very bland, right? So it's less is more. It's very like simple colors, pastel, sans serif font, not a lot of excess in the advertising, the marketing, in the distribution as well. And so this less is more approach kind of presents the Blands as standing outside of this corporate world and other institutional structures. And in particular, when we're thinking about the public transit space, which is very high, oversaturated with ads, the Blands kind of serve as a way to sort of not be so obtrusive within this space. And I'm looking at how these churches reflect a similar kind of aversion to an excess sort of evangelical message that might be connected to more complex Christian institutions. So a few ways that this happens. So one is looking at the names and logos. Blands often choose a simple one word or even one syllable name that has some vague connection to the product being sold. So you have Casper, you have Quip, you have Away. And the churches reflect this similar approach of breaking away from complex theology and denominational structures by using simple names, these kind of simple line drawings, connections to Christianity, but not to a particular denomination. So it's actually, you have to sort of dig deep into their websites to find the connection to the SBC. And so they're really trying to maybe potentially kind of intrigue curiosity from the viewer rather than sort of focus on a particular connection to denominational affiliation. So as I mentioned, all 3 of the churches ran transit ads starting around 2018, and they resemble Blands in different ways. So Schote talks about the way that Bland's have this kind of simple, neutral, and flat design. They might have a kind of plain pastel palette, and there might be kind of an occasional sort of vibrant splash of color. So we can see here in the ads for Quip and Harry's razors that they have this basic design that focuses on the simple technical efficiency of the product and the ease of service. So you have a splash of bright color that might bring energy to the ad, but doesn't overwhelm the viewer. And so we can look at some of the ads that appeared from the churches. So Mosaic Boston, I think, was the first one of the series, and they're probably the most effective at, I think, playing on this simple aesthetics and using this kind of pastel, soft glow that they bring to the urban imagery. So I don't know if you can see here, I took these pictures myself, but you can see how they'll take, what could be conceived as sort of like a cold stone building and bring sort of this warm, kind of peachy glow to it. And if you spend any time on Instagram, you'll see this kind of like light tan, peachy, burnt sienna color appears sort of in a lot of spaces right now on Instagram. So thinking about how they're bringing sort of a nice, warm, comforting glow to the urban imagery. Kings Hill Boston, I think, is clearly playing off of what Mosaic Boston did here. And they're trying to, I think they're less successful for a few reasons. One, I think because they're using the sort of primary colors rather than the sort of soft pastels. Also, I think the image that they chose is very busy and chaotic. And then I think just from the graphic design standpoint of the lettering, it's not as tight fitting, and it just doesn't have the same comforting look to it. But I think we can look at the words that they're using, and similar to Bland's, they are trying to sort of reflect this kind of simple, straightforward message that's not too theological or complex. So they point to basic elements of Christianity, a focus on Jesus, love, community, a calling to something greater. So again, reflecting sort of how the Blands have this sort of simple, straightforward approach. Another trend with Bland's is this kind of cutesy line drawings that they use. And this is a way to sort of convey the sort of simplicity of the process, how it works, right? But also to take sort of technology and science and to make it seem nice and comforting and simple and easy to use. So these are a few examples of this. And so Koa, City on a Hill Church, they had a similar, I think, practice of using this nice, soft seafoam green color, and then having these cute little line drawings of the Boston landmarks and the churches, and then the little stick figures. And so again, a way to sort of take the urban and the chaos and the stress of living in a city and calm it with these nice, cute line drawings, right? So in the longer paper, I go into a bit more detail about the websites, and there's a lot of really fascinating stuff on the websites in terms of how they kind of convey what we believe, which they all say the same thing, what we believe. And they have this kind of simple little point by point explaining what the church believes, and thinking about how that is again reflecting this like straightforward, simple approach. And so I want to look a little bit as I'm wrapping up about the way that these churches, they're very successful at playing into this sort of simple approach of marketing this hip version of Christianity through this progressive messaging about loving Jesus, caring for others, and growing together in a supportive community. But at the same time, these are all SBC funded churches. And so if you start to sort of dig a little deeper into the websites, you see what they actually believe. And so I think there's one way you could critique these churches and say, oh, they're just like tricking people and manipulating them and trying to get people in the door. But at the same time, I think it's interesting to look at like the limitations of this type of advertising for getting their message across. And so there's this common concern, that this exists going back to early days of evangelicalism, that in order to reach the unwashed masses, you have to appeal to popular culture, right? You have to appeal to consumer culture. And so that risks watering down your messages. But in this case, the particular style of Bland's is deinstitutional, it's individualized, it's very, intuitional. And so they're having to sort of take the SBC message, which is very focused on authority and structure, and fit it into this approach. And so if you go deeper into their websites, you can start to see the way that institutional authority is emphasized. So for example, this is from Kings Hill Church. They talk about the Bible as emphasized as foundational religious authority. And specifically, it says not personal preferences, not culture, right? Also thinking about gender roles, the church plans promote traditional gender roles within church leadership. All of the pastors are men. And the women sort of have this sort of helpmate role within the churches. And they also emphasize the importance of specific gender roles within the family. This church sermons also focus on God's design. These ideas come up a lot, right? That God has designed sexuality and gender in a particular way. So secular culture might push for individual happiness and desire within sexual relationships, but the church teaches that God has designed sexuality in a particular manner. So again, I don't find that the church plants are trying to hide their true beliefs. I think they're very prominent, but they struggle to have it both ways, to lean into what is popular within the advertising in the secular culture, which is this personalized choice, and then to reinforce the authority of the religious institutions. So just to conclude, I find it really hard to gauge the return on investment of these, all of this work that's being done, but I think clearly a lot of work and effort and money is going into this. And so I'm sort of speculate a bit in the article about what this is done for. And I talk about how potentially this is like a new city on the hill, which is a way of sort of portraying or projecting this image of success and reaching out to this sort of secular missionary field of, Boston, for potentially the funders, right, who are supporting these projects for the other churches that they're competing with. So I think through a little bit about that, but thank you everyone for attending and look forward to answering questions. Stop sharing my screen.
Okay. That was great. Thank you, everybody. Really interesting stuff. And we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'll try to do the best that I can in terms of moderating. And please, I know some people early on just said, oh, I have a question for someone. So I may turn to you, but I want to try and moderate this as much as I can. And being that where we ended up in the conversation and it being about marketing, I can't help but jump in. I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator of the panel to ask the first question, and I'll jump back to some of the earlier ones. And I think mine is very similar to Michael's, and he asks, do you have data, the response of unaffiliated hipsters when, as they discover the underlying support of the SBC, do they feel, and for want of a better word, duped? And I had exactly the same response as Michael did. And my question was, does the product deliver on what the promotion is? And if not, is this being effective? Because they're using something new and hip doesn't mean it's effective. Right. And the other reason why they're probably using it is it's really cheap. It's a really inexpensive way to advertise, to do things on buses and transport and so on, but also to use simple color tones is also an inexpensive way. So I'm wondering, one, do religious consumers feel duped like Michael? And is this effective? And are they doing anything beyond the local marketing of that? Because what's the connection?
So I think all of those are like super interesting questions that I'm wanting to sort of look at more. This is really a new project for me entirely, and also I kind of was interested in this because I was like, secularities doesn't really relate to what I'm researching, so I started to look in this new direction, and then I just started to find there was really fascinating stuff. So I definitely think that like that's something that I want to look into more, is to do more, as you're saying, like more of a quantitative study, because as I was doing this research, I wasn't able to really get at a lot of the behind the scenes. I tried to contact all the churches, and they were either like push me off to like a volunteer who really didn't know much about this, or they just said, oh, we're too busy or whatever. So I definitely want to do more, because I find there's not a lot of research on this, and not a lot of people have talked about these church plants. The only thing that I found in sort of doing reading was a book that was written by Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, I believe. And he was talking about like contemporary progressive Christianity. And he mentioned these churches and talked about them as sort of like pseudo hipster, like they have this like hipster facade to them. So I definitely want to do more on this, because I feel like there is something going on there with people who might be attracted to go to the church and read more, and then sort of say, hey, wait a minute, like this isn't really what I thought this was about. One point I do have is doing sort of looking up the reviews for the churches. You know, you can like Google reviews. There's like one person who's gone to like 3 of these churches, and he said like, this church is a fake like SBC church, like they're just trying to get you in the door. And so I think that's there for sure. And I think that's like definitely something I want to like start to look into a bit more, is to find a bit about how effective this is, right? But yeah, thank you for those questions.
Yeah, thanks. Just because Michael got his question asked in terms of Kristin, I'm going to go to Johanna. I'm going to go back to Lynn's. Johanna, do you want to ask your question? You said you have a question about Lynn's paper about secularities and trauma related to critical literature.
Thank you. So great papers. All papers were very exciting and great. And actually, if I may, I would like to expand my question to all the speakers. And it is related to secularities. As one of the organizers of this event, maybe it's useful to remind you that one of the reasons why we chose this theme is that this was going to be in Sweden, the conference, as an on-site event. And this is Sweden is a society which secularity plays a very important role in the public space, even though there is, of course, the role of the church is also important, but there is a very European way of approaching that and the idea of secularity. So this is where it came from, and we kind of transformed it into also this symposium. Having said that, I was thinking when I was listening to your papers that could you all kind of explore or elaborate how you actually, how would you articulate the idea and concept of secularity in your work? Because it was present in all of your papers. But if you could just kind of articulate that, because I think that it would help us also to kind of think more of this concept, and also, of course, we can challenge the relevance of the concept, but I think that it has relevance, and it plays a role in that, in the work, in the kind of work that we do, and it also kind of reveals the different contexts that we are working on. It tells something about the different contexts that we are working on, which I think is important for our organization, which is a kind of a international and global organization. Yes, so this was basically my question, and then we can chat with Lynn about critical literature on trauma studies later.
Right, because Joanna has a lot of expertise in this area. So I do want to acknowledge that and thank her for that. And so I will start by recognizing that, yes, I think that this conference is different because we're able to be online and from our various settings, from the context in which we're doing our research, as opposed to all coming together in Sweden and being able to observe something about the historic relationship between the Swedish church and the state. I think my context, of course, is in the United States, where religion has been understood as a voluntary practice to some extent, as opposed to something that is related to the state, meaning that it's a context in which people choose, or that's what we think, they're choosing their religion. And so we're kind of looking at it within the marketplace model, I think, in terms of the United States. And I think that what has happened historically in the United States is that there is also a long-term tradition between specifically Christianity, but not only Christianity, and different institutions of society that serve the public welfare. So, our hospitals in the United States often have historically Christian links or Jewish links. There are hospitals, there are schools, various institutions that have these historic links with religious organizations. So the idea of the separation between the secular and the religious plays out differently in the United States context. One of the things that I want to acknowledge too is that when I started this work on anchoring narratives, it was actually with Mary Hess, who I think is on this call or was on the last call, and she and I started out by doing digital storytelling within religious congregations, Jewish and mainstream Protestant and more conservative Protestant, to kind of look at how they might use digital storytelling and video forms as a way of reinforcing, I guess, what Heidi has called storied identity, kind of looking at how it is that religious communities can then kind of foster a sense of belonging and collective identity through the use of media. I kind of transitioned personally to working with different partners in society that were taking on more, as I think in some ways in the US context, as religion has shifted to more of the kinds of things that Kristin and Kate and Margaret are talking about, which is more personal identity links with the commercial culture. The whole realm of this former service orientation of religious that has its roots in religious organizations has shifted and is now probably seen to a much greater extent as part of the quote unquote secular realm. When we think about social workers, for instance, or schools or government, we think of that as if it is completely divorced in a historical way from these religious traditions. So I think it is really an interesting, what I was trying to argue, and this comes out of my experience of having worked with social workers and people in school settings and so-called secular settings who actually end up bringing together young people from a variety of religious traditions and no religious traditions. How do they negotiate these ideas of what do we do when we see ourselves as thinking about healing as primary to what we do, thinking about healing also as linked with social justice. So I think what I would like to, I guess, say is, I think that, the whole idea of secularism is something that does need to be unpacked in relation to historical context. And so I appreciate Johanna's question, and I'll gladly turn it over to Isra.
Well, thank you for the question. I think this reminded me a little bit of Tim's presentation in the first panel, where he started off talking about how the notion of secularity is inherently sort of debated. I think in my work, especially because I'm thinking about it in relationship to Islam, I'm really interested in the perception of secularity rather than the reality of what secularism actually is. And in North America, and I'm also thinking about contexts like in France, where they're talking about the hijab and bans and things, the perception, what I find fascinating about secularism when it's discussed in popular culture and popular discourses is that secularism is often conceptualized as an absence, as if you are inherent, or if you're secular, if you're part of secular society, that you're somehow empty of ideology in some way, which is ironic because also my family, who are devout Muslims, consider me that also, because I'm not a devout Muslim. So if you aren't being a fully pious Muslim, they're just like, are you just an empty vessel of nothing? But of course, being someone who was raised in a devout Muslim family, but who doesn't practice it, I exist in this world in which I am, quote, secular, but deeply informed by the ways in which I was raised and the religious communities I was raised in. But in the United States, there's this very fascinating way in which secularism is kind of like a sponge in which particular religious beliefs are thought to be able to be within secularism and are thought to be able to exist, but others are not. And so I'm very interested in the way in which those perceptions create those kind of boundaries where suddenly secularism is considered something that Christianity can belong to, but Islam cannot, and what that means when we're having discussions about secularism. And then, of course, as Kate and as your presentation brings up also, that there's a fear about fundamentalism in Christianity, and this kind of language about the Christian Taliban, and this idea that that there's a kind of extremism that's emerging around Christianity that also might be resistant to secularism. And so there's an interesting way, I find it fascinating, the way in which suddenly there's a kind of assigning of this kind of category that this one type of religious belief can't be secular, but say Buddhism can, right? And we all do the yoga and we're all, oming, and that is completely compatible with secular life. So that's what I'm interested in, though I'm unfortunately completely useless in terms of actually offering you a specific academic sort of definition of secularism, but the perception of it, I think, is what I find really interesting. I'll hand it off to Margaret and Kate.
Yeah, thank you. I think as we were analyzing these TikToks, we did not find sort of religion and secularity, religion as a binary to be a particularly useful way to analyze them. But, it's very clear that the TikTokers considered it to be a helpful binary. So I think Isra is right on the nose with the idea that the perception of secularity is what is interesting and far more important here. Like, we found that secularity was only important insofar as that it really fueled these Christian TikTokers' sense of persecution. And so many of the TikToks that we encountered were framed as a response to persecution, a response to the perceived secularity of TikTok.
Yeah, I was thinking in my studies, for a lot of these churches, there's a lot of like kind of anxiety and a sense that like over secularity. So there's a sense that like evangelical Christians have always used popular culture and have always wanted to engage with popular culture, right? They don't want to stand outside of it, but at the same, and so they see it as a useful tool, right? So you hear a lot of language about like using it for sanctifying it, right? Using it for a good reason and a good purpose. But at the same time, then when you look at when you look at like the sermons and the things that are on their websites, I mean, it's really reinforcing that secular culture is a danger and is something that is a threat, and the need to reinforce the authority of the Bible and church to help you sort of live your life within this secular culture. So it's an interesting kind of back and forth that you see happening in a lot of these spaces.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Tia, because your question is not quite a question, I'm going to open the floor to you to ask. You said you have a question for both Lynn and Isra. And since you're calling in from Indonesia, I have to let you into this. Tia, you there?
Hello, can you hear my voices? Because I don't have a broadband connection.
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm asking about the notion of anchoring narratives. How do you deal it to negotiate with different kind of multicultural society in terms of different kind of sphere? I mean, you know, it's like that. How to mediate such different kind of interests from this kind of layers of audience in my term. That's a bit. I wish you get my point. Did you get that point? Because I think I found some similarities in my case study in Indonesia about how the Muslim society try to cope with different kind of narratives dealing with minorities group in Indonesia, and that's a kind of a little bit harder here. Thanks.
Yes, I would love to hear more about your context and about your experience with that, because I do feel like this is an area that is, you know, is really of interest to me. I think when we're talking about secularities, I think what you are speaking of, Tia, and I think actually what I was speaking of was perhaps more likely to be captured by ideas of multicultural society or plural societies, where there are dominant perspectives that have control over the discourse and that are linked historically in certain ways with, in the US case, Christianity, in the Indonesian case, perhaps Islam. So that there would be different ways of addressing minority communities, minority religious communities, as well as cultural communities. I think one of the things that draws me to trying to analyze this is that I have been reading a lot in social work and in indigenous fields and things, and I don't necessarily, I see that there is a lot of sense of the pragmatics of leveraging media in a certain way to go about creating voice or helping people to feel like they have voice. And there's quite a bit of debate about the extent to which we have to also create an audience. I mean, you know, this kind of goes with Nick Codry's work and some other people who are working on the idea of voice in public. And what does it mean to try to provide avenues not only for people to feel that they have been given an opportunity to say to talk about their experience, but also to be heard in what settings. And I think there is an increasing conversation happening in the US context about this issue issue of translation and about intermediaries, and how is it that, you know, it's one thing to have people create these stories within these certain settings. How do you actually create an audience, whether it's an audience of policymakers or an audience of social movement leaders, so that you can kind of bring these two together? And that's not something that that I think we in the US, it's not very easy to do. There's a lot of translation work that happens, especially among critical race theory oriented youth work that tries to bring young people's perspectives into the conversation with policymakers. So for example, the examples that I show or talk about in the article that's, or the paper that's part of this presentation, was about some young people who talked about their lived experience of gentrification and how they experienced that in their neighborhoods. And then I worked with a number of other people who were influencers within government to try to find a place to get those stories in front of policymakers who were also working on issues of gentrification, so that they could then, you know, find linkages that were meaningful both for the young people to feel like they were actually having a role in how policies are being shaped and playing out, as well as so that they could feel, the policymakers could see, oh, there actually are some voices that I can work with and can call upon beyond my own immediate circle. But I feel like there is a lot in our structures that limit that possibility for voice. And I think that is something that needs to be acknowledged. And I do feel like that's something that we really need to continue to work on, is this area of who are the intermediaries, and, you know, how do our structures, including structures of social media, really make that much more difficult as a process of helping people to have voice within democratic systems. So thank you for the question, and I look forward to reading your paper.
Thanks, Lynn. Let's get to a couple of questions. People have some questions for Margaret and Kate, and they seem to be along the line of criticism of the work. How much and what kinds of criticism did #Christian check did you see, particularly in relationship to theological and identity aspects, especially from the evangelical crowd? And alternatively, what kind of response did these TikTok get from anti-religious groups?
Yeah, so we definitely saw a pretty broad range of anti-Christian check responses that I think can generally be categorized into two different types. I'll just briefly describe the first one, and then I'll pass it off to Kate. But the first one is I think kind of unexpected, and that is a more conservative Christian backlash to Christian check, specifically critiquing that this trend is too worldly or materialistic. We saw one video where it was a teenage girl who identified as a Christian, and just the whole video was just her standing in the frame with some text in front of her saying, I'm thinking that this trend isn't very Christian, and then in the comments was sounding off with other people in her Christian peer group debating whether or not the trend was really Christian at its root. So one category is that we see kind of a more conservative Christian response, saying that the trend maybe engages with what they perceive as the secular too much. And then
another example of that kind of response is many people would display their tattoos. They often had scripture tattooed on them. And we read one comment that said, "Is that a tattoo? Jesus would be proud," with like the rolling on the floor laughing emoji. So there are sort of like active engagements among Christians going on, arguing over like what a good Christian check looks like. And then we also want to share with you one particular TikTok.
Christian check. Jesus, 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 Jesus. I love to praise your name.
So if you can read that, it says, "No candy. Our home does not celebrate Halloween. Read the Bible." And the comments are absolutely just like wrecking this person. And you also see, you know, similar comments even on the, not this, yeah, so occasionally, especially the TikToks in this trend that went particularly viral, like the original TikTok that started the trend as an example of this, we would see people saying things like, haha, well, I'm a witch. How do you feel about that? In the comments. And so there was a really substantial amount of pushback, both from within people who considered themselves part of the Christian TikTok community and from people who avidly did not.
The same is very much true for Muslims online, like very similar responses. And is this really, is this really Muslim? Is this really, okay to do? And then, of course, back and forth. I find those back and forth very, very fascinating, sort of very instructive about the debate fundamentally about social media and whether it allows you to be truly inhabiting that religious kind of identity or whether it actually pulls you away, which is, I think, why I always am fascinated by the way the social media is considered secular inherently and thought about as a secular sort of space and potentially influencing thing. Not to jump in on your answer, but.
No, jump in. That's exactly what you should do. Let's continuing on this conversation. I think this will probably apply to Isra as well. Is folks have questions about whether or not there was a difference in terms of gender, in terms of those who were participants in this. What strategies would you suggest for scholars in terms of analyzing TikTok, which I think is a great question. And I would say that to Isra too, if you have suggestions about how to go about that in social spaces. And then this last question was, I noticed a frequent use of Christian in your presentation as well as in the example videos. How could you use TikTok to dig deeper into what kind of Christianity is meant, not just theologically, but in terms of race, gender, class, etc.?
Yeah, so there are a number of challenges presented in analyzing TikToks. One is just that when a certain TikTok becomes viral, people start to use the Christian check sound and use hashtag Christian check, but they're not actually following the Christian check format. So one thing that's really popular on Christian TikTok is 15-second sermons. And so you would have somebody who had like quietly the Christian check music and hashtag Christian check, but they're like not doing the trend. So that is something that provides a particular challenge for us, because even though we say there are 19.8 thousand videos under the tag Christian check, like many of those were not actually employing the Christian check format.
And then to kind of start to answer Lauren's second question, which is a lot of what we hope to touch on in a paper that furthers this research. There are obviously a lot of race, class, gendered dynamics occurring in this trend, especially as it involves sexuality, particularly with the videos that we showed that involved Chick-fil-A. One of the most popular types of response videos that we viewed from this trend was LGBTQ people responding kind of negatively. And so queerness and the interaction of homophobia in this trend and responses to this trend is definitely something that we're going to take a look at. Another interesting thing that we noticed was the American TikToks that fell in line with this trend versus the non-American. The American responses did tend to fall disproportionately to white women, whereas the non-American responses tended to be more diverse. And there was a really strongly gendered component, particularly within the American TikToks, of a lot of times when American men or teenagers would post a TikTok
engaging with this trend, they would kind of be embarrassed about it. They would kind of justify in the caption or the comments, like, oh, I was just like doodling in my Bible one day when I was bored, or oh, my mom bought all these crosses, which is, again, something that we would love to talk about in more depth in future work. So I hope that started to answer that question.
One thing I find very interesting about looking at Muslims online is the role and the question of surveillance. And so there's one of the reasons why it's interesting to look at it in the context of war on terror militarism is that for the first kind of decade of the war on terror, there's this kind of robust resistance to the idea of surveillance, because the government is watching you and there's a kind of pushback. But more recently, and I saw this especially amongst young Muslim American college students who are purposely creating these meme pages as a way of sharing the lived everyday experience of being Muslim, as a way of really is sort of saying we can be American and Muslim, is that there's an interesting way in which they have embraced the idea of surveillance. So they know they are being watched, and they know that they are being watched both by Muslims, and there's a long running joke about the Muslim Student Association. I think Michael also referred to the Haram police, but there's the Muslim Student Association is like a mini surveillance association, and so there's lots of memes about how the MSA is watching you. The MSA and the NSA are both watching you. The state and the MSA are, and then there's sort of a way in which they are trying to empower themselves by embracing surveillance and saying, well, if we are going to be constantly watched, then what is it that we want to articulate? And so, not everyone wants to talk to me about their social media presence, but there are particular kind of young people who have really embraced the idea that they want to say, they want to talk about who they are instead of being talked about by other people. And they'd rather do the talking about who they are than, let's say, a television network or a film studio do the work of representation. And if I am approaching, doing research on social media and reaching out to them, and I'm very wary of, sharing their names or publishing anything in print that would impact them. They want to know primarily how my perspective, right? Am I writing about how Islam is a scourge in the US and how it's destroying these young people, or am I someone who's sympathetic to what they believe? And so they, often want to hear about my personal experience about growing up Muslim and want me to be as honest and sort of forthright with them about the fact that I'm not a devout practicing Muslim now, but it's an interesting kind of dynamic. And I actually find that women are much more, young women in particular, are much more open to talking with me about their use of online media and social media. I don't know if it's a self-conscious thing, as Margaret and Kate are pointing out with the dudes who are like, my mom bought the crosses, but I don't know if there's kind of a way in which there's a gendering of the idea of social media, because we tend to associate social media with a kind of narcissism that we then put onto young women in particular. And there's a kind of gendered aspect in general outside of religion that is related there. But I find it very interesting in the way in which young Muslims in particular are really taking the idea of surveillance and thinking about how to mess with it a little bit in order to create their own perceptions and really insist on making representations of themselves and not just leaving it to other people.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap up with a couple of questions for Kristin. And Andrew asks, on another panel, I see that with these church plants would be private label products with SBC beliefs, doctrine repackaged for different markets. My question is this: for those members of church plants, how do they construe their religious identity and church belonging? Do they claim membership to the Bland or to SCB, mere Christian, or does it even matter how they identify?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Definitely, they do not seem to identify as SBC. I think they identify as part of the particular church. So that's really interesting to think about the way that they are connect with the brand. And what I mean by that is that, like, you can see within the church website and social media that, for example, with Mosaic, the idea of love Jesus simple is used in a lot of different ways. It's not just the ad campaign. So it definitely connects to like how people identify. And you see, I did speak with one volunteer from COA, and she talks about COA, and that's how she calls the church COA rather than City on a Hill, and talks about, we're a network church, we're a small community. So I definitely think that they identify more with the particular church that they attend rather than denomination. And I think we probably see that in other, other churches as well, right? I mean, I think, or even in other religious traditions as well in the US, you see people who are Catholic, but really just attend this one particular church that they're engaged with, and they identify with that particular community. So I think, again, it relates to this branding and this brand identity that Mara's talked about before and written about. Yeah.
Another question for you, Kristin.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the constraints of simplistic marketing as a moment when SBC theology gets watered down in order to be palatable to consumers. How do you see this kind of advertising in turn affecting the SBC as an institution? So I guess, does the simplicity at the local level affect the larger institution?
Mm-hmm.
And does this effort to simplify theological claims and structures and communication have an impact on SBC's normative claims or structures?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a question thinking through, looking at this project going forward to look at, because I think for sure you're seeing this kind of challenge of like, if engaging with the secular culture, if that is going to really water down the message and the importance that of the institutional and authority of the SBC. I mean, I think it's really fascinating the way that these churches don't identify as SBC, and they're really focused on enforcing the beliefs rather than the institution. And so it will be interesting to see whether that will affect the institution going forward, because it sort of seems like, well, why do you need to be a member of this institution? Why can't you just believe the things that the church believes? But yeah, so I think that will be, that's an interesting question to look at, especially as these church plants grow, or I don't necessarily know that they grow. There's a lot of church plants. There aren't necessarily a lot of people that go to the church plants. There's lots of church, they're seeing the numbers of church plants are increasing, but not necessarily the number of SBC members. So that's interesting to look at as well. But yeah, I think those are interesting questions to think through taking this project further. Thank you.
I have a question for Margaret and Kate. Can I ask my question? Are we allowed to do that?
Yes, we have 2 minutes.
All right, quickly, Margaret and Kate, have you seen the kind of bullet journal phenomenon? So there's all these videos about very extensive kind of journaling. And when you were showing the particular kind of material practices of the very kind of elaborate writing, it reminded me of that. And I was just wondering if there was any crossover between these communities, or if you're thinking about it in the sort of Pinterest, Etsy, kind of like thinking about how those particular trends kind of transfer, those secular trends transfer over into the Christian kind of realm of TikTok.
It's funny you should ask, because I actually have a bullet journal and am sort of obsessed with the bullet journal YouTube community. It's a very interesting trend. And I think there's certainly crossover in terms of like the way that people are cultivating their sort of devotional journals, and it becomes, I don't know, integrated in their everyday life rituals that they do. And so I can see that for sure in terms of like, not only creating these things in these material practices, but like the desire to display them almost as like a form of ministry, I think. So that's a really interesting point that we will definitely be thinking about more.
I really noticed some similarities in the aesthetic. It was very interesting.
Yeah, definitely.